Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Annita Lucchesi is a researcher, scholar, and community organizer of Cheyenne and Italian descent, currently living on the Wiyot territory in Northern California. Annita serves as founding executive director of the Sovereign Bodies Institute, a nonprofit research institute that builds on Indigenous traditions of data gathering and knowledge transfer to put into action research on gender and sexual violence against Indigenous people. This includes creating and maintaining the MMIWG database, which logs cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people from 1900 to the present. Annita is also a doctoral student at the University of Arizona in the School of Geography, Development, and Environment with a minor in gender and women's studies. Her dissertation work examines the intersections of data, violence against Indigenous women and girls, and cartography. Annita also has 10 years experience as a freelance cartographer. Her specialties here include mapping Indigenous narratives, mapping for social justice, and mapping geographies of violence. So thank you very much, Annita, for sharing your time and expertise with us today. We're thrilled to have you here for the hour. I invite the audience to submit questions through the Q&A box in your Zoom window as they occur to you for the discussion at the end of Annita's talk. And right now, I invite you to welcome Annita Lucchesi. Annita, I will turn the screen over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining, and thank you for the introduction and the invitation to share some of my work with everybody today. It's really exciting for me. I do get to share our work at Sovereign Bodies Institute quite a bit, but less so my academic work and my work as a cartographer. So I'm really excited to get to have that conversation today. And I want to start by also acknowledging that I'm due for an update on my bio. I'm no longer based in Northern California. I very recently moved to Southern Arizona. So today I'm joining you from Tono O'odham territory in the city of Tucson. So I have some slides I will share and we will get started. Okay, here we go. Everybody can see the slides good? I'm going to assume yes if no one's telling me no. So today we're talking about mapping for social change and what decolonial and anti-oppression mapping might look like. And I want to start by saying that I'm super passionate about this subject and definitely a map nerd and take pride in being an Indigenous map nerd. But this stuff is all things that we're learning as we go and ideas very much still in development. So part of this is my story and my experiences thus far and what some of my initial thoughts are based on a few years of doing this kind of mapping work, but also hopefully a platform for continued and future work. So part of my dissertation work now looks at empowering Indigenous survivors of violence and family members of missing and murdered Indigenous people to make their own maps, telling their own stories of violence, but to also reimagine and draw on new geographies of what healing, justice, or safety might look like. So this stuff is, all of the work that I'm sharing today is very much ongoing. And I'm going to start by sharing a little bit about my story, how I became a cartographer, why I think maps are particularly powerful, how maps have been a healing force for me personally, and then talk more about how I see maps being really important in our work to affect social change. And I want to leave everybody with some tips on making your own anti-oppression maps. I think that cartography is something that is often made to feel really inaccessible in the sense that it might take fancy software or years and years of training. And there certainly are fabulous trainings and classes out there. And there's plenty of fancy softwares to choose from. But really, all of us are capable of being cartographers, no matter what your skill level might be or what access to technology you might have. And, you know, I say that as somebody who, like, if you use Google Maps to get from A to B, you're a cartographer. If you ever made a treasure map as a kid, you're a cartographer. So maps don't have to be something created in GIS, and they don't have to be something that feels really inaccessible or distant or fancy. I think everybody is capable of being a map, and that's of creating a map, and that's what we're partially going to talk about today. So a little bit on my story of how I came to be a cartographer and how I came to some of these ideas. So my bachelor's degree is in geography from UC Berkeley. And at that time, they had a really great 1-year-long cartography program as part of the undergraduate degree. And it was led by Darren Jensen, who went on to co-found Guerrilla Cartography. And I really want to credit Darren as being an instructor that really went above and beyond to empower not just me, but all of his students to really make the connection between maps and issues of social justice. So that was something that was really impressed upon us from an early beginning in learning the fundamentals of how to create a map, and definitely informed my journey as a cartographer. But at the same time, I was also learning post-colonial theory for the first time. So I was reading scholars like Frantz Fanon and Edward Said for the first time, and that was really liberating and exciting for me. And so to have that kind of confluence of post-colonial theory and this really deeply rooted community idea of cartography, that's what kind of led me down this path of thinking about maps as a tool for social justice, and particularly in thinking about maps as part of our work in working to decolonize. The other piece of it for me is, of course, as an undergrad, I was pretty young. I was 20 when I was going through this kind of moment in my intellectual development. So I was also going through a big moment in personal development. And so it became a really kind of exciting time for me, holistically, intellectually, but also in my personal life, to really use maps as a way to explore the experiences of my community, some of the things that I was going through. So I grew up in a really rural area that has a long and ongoing legacy of really violent extractive industries. And my family has been part of that. I come from a long line of loggers and uncles with missing fingers from working in mills. And my family, is still partially a part of that industry. And I also come from a community where there was a lot of rapid change due to changes in extractive industry over time, and a lot of inequality and poverty. So I grew up in rural Northern California, which is also now one of the predominant producers of marijuana and has been for decades, long before legalization. And so there were issues with that as well. So when I moved to the Bay Area for school, I was also navigating how to be in a city for the first time. Everybody was asking me for marijuana all the time, and I didn't have it, and was really confused by that and felt like, do I belong here? And it felt very unfamiliar. And so I was trying to make sense of all those kind of different pieces of my own story and my own journey. And then also at the same time, that was the first time I experienced sexual violence. And I'm very public about the different forms of violence that I've experienced. I won't go into detail here because that's not really what we're talking about, but I was sexually assaulted by a classmate and then harassed by a faculty member that I was working for as a research assistant. And that faculty member, unfortunately, is still at the university and was tenured. And even though I reported, not much was done. And so I was, at one time reading really exciting literature and getting a whole new way of analyzing the world and a whole new way of thinking about space and relationships, and inequality and geography. And then on the other side of things, I was like in this really dark place of feeling like, maybe I don't belong in academia. Maybe I'm not somebody who can be a researcher or a knowledge producer. Maybe these spaces aren't for me. And also feeling really unsafe in academia. And maps were kind of my way out of that dark place and my way of thinking through how academia might be something that's not only safe for me, but empowering. And Maps actually, I created maps on inequality and resources extraction in my community as part of my undergraduate thesis. And that's what propelled me to a career in grad school and beyond, was having the opportunity to really make sense of what had happened to me and to my community and to the places that I came from, in a way where I had the power of explaining what the narrative is. And I got to decide what the boundaries were and what they weren't. I got to create a way of telling that story that felt good to me, that felt good to my family and to my community, that was legible to them in a way that maybe an academic paper, wouldn't resonate. That's what's led me to stick with maps all these years later. So the map on this slide is something I made much more recently. I made it last year. Guerrilla Cartography does a really fabulous event called Atlas in a Day, where they'll give out a theme, and by the end of the day, you have to turn in a map that speaks to that theme. So last year's theme was community, and this is the map that I created as kind of a response to that theme, with the idea of trying to map out what Indigenous community really looks like. And for me, especially, like, we were in the midst of the pandemic at this time, we weren't able to gather in the ways and create community in person in the ways that I was used to, but we were still creating really thriving national and international communities using social media and through my work in Indigenous communities. So this is a map of all the places I sent emails or text messages or phone calls in the month of May last year, or the first half of May last year, with Indigenous place names, as a way to show that actually the lived experience of Indigenous geographies is much more diverse than people may realize, much more expansive than people may realize. And sometimes it happens through, day-to-day technology like emails. So I share this map as an example to show that I think that maps can be a really powerful way of showing complex geographies, complex systems of relationships that speak to our day-to-day experiences in a way that maybe other forms of data visualization or storytelling can't. The other example I want to share, this is a map from my master's thesis. So I am a survivor of domestic violence, sexual assault, and trafficking. The photo that you see on this slide is a picture of me while I was being trafficked. And I share it as an example to show that I think there's a lot of stereotypes out there of who gets trafficked and what they look like and what their life story is. And my experience doesn't match any of those stereotypes. There was no van in a Walmart parking lot. I didn't grow up in a violent home. I didn't grow up around substance use. It was two Indigenous people who were trying the best they could to survive in the midst of a lot of trauma and a lot of structural violence. And that was my experience. So I made this map as a part of trying to make sense of the violence after I had left it. After I escaped my abuser, I was working on my master's thesis, which was on maps as a way to tell stories of genocide in Indigenous communities. And I wanted to show that, to me, the legacy of genocide, or one of the legacies, is that we've lost our ability to relate to each other in a healthy way in a lot of situations. And every man that I had an abusive relationship with was Native and also was a victim of violence in their own right, and oftentimes multiple forms of violence. So this map was telling my story and their stories. And the fabric of the map, kind of in the background, is abusive text messages, photos of us, with the idea that our relationships are part of the fabric of the land. Our stories are part of the fabric of the land. And me telling our stories in this way, with names changed and identifiers removed so that everything was safe and respectful for them too. It was a way of reclaiming the violence that happened to me and happened to them, and naming it, and making sense of the fact that, like, I didn't blame my abuser. I blamed the colonial state and the colonial system for creating him that way and for allowing him to abuse me. And this map was my way of telling that story on my own terms in a way that felt safe to me and safe to others, but that still had power in it to fully account for the ways that that the United States as a colonial occupation was involved in the violence that happened to me and happened to them. This is another map from that same project, my master's thesis. And the reason that I share it here is because it's a big part of a turning point for me, along with the one on the previous slide, in thinking about maps as a form of healing and empowerment. So this map was trying to account for all the different ways that Indigenous peoples have been made to disappear from the landscape, and kind of refusing that disappearance and that narrative of empty lands by actually placing their faces and their stories directly on the land itself. And so the image you see on the right is kind of a clearer image of what the background of the map looks like, with some of the faces of the stories that are given as examples of different forms of violence. And missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls was one of the issues on this map, one of many, and was what launched a whole new path for me and a whole new path in my healing and professionally in working to address violence in our communities. So I needed a good working number of how many cases had occurred in the US and Canada. And at that time, this was about 6 years ago, there was lots of lists for Canada, but they didn't really match. And then there weren't really any data sources for the US. And so I was kind of naive in thinking like, I can just cross-reference all these lists and news articles and I'm gonna come up with a number that way. And I thought that the project would have a start and an end. And now 6 years later, I've accepted that, this is probably going to be my life's work. And that list never stopped. And that list is never something that I, put away or put to the side. And it ultimately led to the creation of Sovereign Bodies Institute, which now is not only home to what is the largest international database on missing and murdered Indigenous people, but is also home to a large number of different community-based research projects to address gender and sexual violence, as well as I think some of the most holistic services out there for survivors and for families of missing and murdered Indigenous people. That includes leadership opportunities. So we actually have a Survivors Leadership Council that's all Indigenous women who are survivors of trafficking or survival sex work. As far as I know, we're the only organization to have that. And all of those ladies are doing incredible work in their respective communities, not just around issues of gender violence, but health equity and taking on leadership in cultural preservation and working in shelters, working with foster kids. All of them do incredible things. And that's kind of the beauty of SBI, is that we're survivor and family led. And this map is what started all of that. It wasn't the intention. I had no idea this map would start any of that. But something as simple as sitting down to try to think of a way to artistically tell the story of the violence that our communities are experiencing created this moment of mobilization and healing for me as a survivor and as a woman who almost was missing or murdered, but also created this bigger ripple effect that brought communities across continents together to address this violence and to continue making maps and to continue gathering research and telling stories on our own terms. The reason I share this map as an example is not only to highlight SBI and that work, but to also see that this is the true power of maps. I think one of the most important things that we can learn about maps is that their value is not in itself as an object. Their value is in the process and the life they take on before, during, and after their creation. So it's not as simple as just, creating an easy data visualization and saying, here you go, that's a cool way to think about it. It's how do I tell this story in a way that really reflects the realities of how the story is felt and experienced? How do I tell this story in a way that heals or empowers or mobilizes? And maps, as kind of the collision of data science and art, have incredible, powerful potential to do just that. And this map is an example of that. I have a couple other examples here. These are maps from an Urban Indian Health Institute report on missing and murdered Indigenous women of urban areas that came out in late 2018. I worked with UIHI to write the report and create these maps. And the reason I share them here is because the aesthetics aren't really what make them drastically, radical. We do have like a basket weave design on the one on the left to honor a traditional story around MMIW and domestic violence and violence against women. But other than that, they're pretty, face value Western style mapping. But what makes them so special is the data that's being represented on the maps and the perspective that they take. The data comes from the database that was inspired by the previous map. And I think the map on the right is what's the most powerful illustration of that. So the orange dots on the top are data that we as survivors and community members were able to gather. The green dots are data collected by law enforcement, and the yellow dots are cases covered by media. So you can see if we relied on law enforcement or the media to give us a full sense of this issue, we would be missing so much of it. And our understanding of the scope, severity, and geography of this kind of violence would be drastically different. So this map, on the one hand, highlights the failures of media and law enforcement, but on the other really champions the success of community-driven data initiatives and places families and survivors as the experts and knowledge producers in a way that maybe other forms of data visualization might not. That's the power of a map. So even if your aesthetics are, as dry as they may come, as with the case on the map on the right, if you make careful intentions about what stories and what data you're uplifting and how you're using maps to highlight that data, there can be really powerful ways of communicating. This goes far beyond just communicating how severe the issue of MMIW is, because it's highlighting that role of community expertise. And I think that's what makes that map so special. And I realize I'm running a little low on time. I want to leave time for questions, and I have a few more slides to get through. So I'm going to power through these last ones pretty quick. These are maps from an article that I published a couple years ago on mapping the life stories of murdered Indigenous women. So the map on the left is the stories of several Inuit women who were murdered in Montreal in the late 2010s. And then the map on the right are Indigenous women who were killed in Thunder Bay in the 1960s. So different provinces, different cities, different time periods, and yet very similar geographies of violence. And the idea behind these maps and the article was to show how colonial states create geographies of violence that Indigenous women have to navigate in their day-to-day lives that make them targets of violence and give them limited options to maybe skirt around violence or to find safety. And I particularly want to draw your attention to the map on the left. One of the things that to me makes it special is it has 3 different scales. So it's 3 different maps on one page. The one in the bottom right-hand corner that shows kind of this zoomed out provincial view, it's quote upside down. It's so the south is on the top and the north is on the bottom. And the reason I flipped it is because at least what's been shared with me by Inuit folks and people who are working with Inuit communities is that this is a more representative view of how Inuit people view the province of Quebec. I wanted to center the villages that these women came from as kind of the starting point for the map, and to move Montreal to kind of the background as a place where the violence occurred, but not the beginning of the story and not the center of the map. And so that's why the direction is flipped as a way to kind of honor these women's perspective on the geographies they were navigating. So I want to close by giving some general remarks on why I think maps are really important for all issues of social justice, not just things like gender violence or Indigenous rights, and then give you guys some pointers on hopefully making some maps of your own. So these are my arguments on why I think maps have everything to do with social justice. First, maps hold authority that other forms of art and storytelling don't. And what I mean by that is, like, if you go into a courtroom and do an interpretive dance, it could be the most powerful dance you've ever done, and it could be breathtaking and, evoke all sorts of emotions, and still the court is going to have no idea what to do with it. But if you come in with it's going to be just as subjective as the dance, and could certainly have all sorts of artistic elements to it. But because colonial systems give such authority to maps and such like heightened objectivity to maps, it's going to carry more weight and more authority, even if it's making the same argument and is, at its core, just as subjective. Maps are also accessible and adaptable in ways that legal political testimony isn't. There's a lot more freedom in the map making process, especially if you're like me and avoid GIS like the plague. I will use it when I have to, but I never let it make a map for me. I think GIS programs make maps. I think they visualize geographic data. And it's on us to transform that visualization into a coherent map. So even when I use GIS, I then take whatever it kicks out for me and move it into Adobe Illustrator and redraw it by hand. And most of my maps, all of the ones you've seen on these slides, are hand drawn in Illustrator because I think there's just so much more freedom that comes with it. Also, injustice in the communities affected by it are place-based. So for Indigenous people, that may seem really intuitive. All of our stories are tied to the land. All of our experiences are tied to the land, even if it's something, as contemporary as, my experience of abuse. It didn't occur on my tribal homeland, and it didn't occur on my abuser's tribal homeland either. It didn't even happen on a reservation. It happened in an urban area, but there were still stories of land dispossession and reclaiming new spaces in urban areas, and those stories are still part of the fabric of that city, to the point where I really don't travel to that city because it can be really emotional for me. And so if we're going to talk about our stories of injustice or our stories of violence, whether we acknowledge it or not, they're always tied to the land and to the location in some capacity. I also think that maps can be a reflection of our cultures and a medium we can use to practice and develop them. So I did not grow up in my tribal community. I did not grow up very connected to my culture, and it's something that I've sought out as an adult and will have a lifetime of learning and reconnecting to do. But mapping has been one way for me to connect to my culture. It's encouraged me to learn some of our language and to learn some of our place names. And there's really fabulous Indigenous cartographers out there who are doing mapping work that actually is deeply grounded in not only their language, but their ancestral epistemologies. Renee Pulani-Lewis, I think, is an amazing inspirational example of that as a Kanaka Maoli cartographer. Lastly, I think cartography by and for oppressed people themselves is a crucial act of sovereignty and healing. So part of the colonial narrative, and I would say parallel track to racist narratives as well, and patriarchal and all the things, is this idea of the more powerful person or the more powerful agency saying, you can't possibly know yourself as well as I know you. I'm going to tell you about yourself. And that's really at the heart of a lot of systematic forms of oppression and violence. So for communities that have experienced that oppression, to be able to say, no, we know ourselves better than you. We know ourselves, we know our people, we know our community, we know the land that we're on, we know our stories, we know our experiences, and we're going to tell them on our own terms. And we're going to draw our relationships to each other and to all these things we're experiencing on our own terms. That's incredibly powerful and has all sorts of generative potential, as seen with the red map on the previous slide, that sparked a whole new organization and database and a whole new way of community organizing. So considerations for cartographers. These are things for you guys to think about. I hope that everyone who leaves becomes a cartographer, even if it's, just at home on your own time, or it's something that helps me a lot as a researcher and as somebody, trying to write out my ideas for, even things like journal publications. I have a whole journal full, like on my desk, full of maps that are just sketches, things that I'm never necessarily going to publish, but help me think through, especially for me as a geographer, the spatial dynamics of the issues I'm trying to explain and address. So these are the 3 questions that I always start with when I start to create a map. First, what's your purpose? What stories do you want to tell? What data are you going to use? Whose voices are you going to uplift and privilege? Who's going to be the expert that gives this map some legs? What do you want the map to do? And then the next question is, who's your audience and what do you want them to get from it? So when I make a map for, for example, in the past, I've worked with Indigenous communities who need maps in court cases to fight extractive industries. That requires a very different kind of map than if I'm working with a group of survivors on mapping our stories of violence. Both are just as valid and just as powerful, but it's a different approach and a different audience. So think through who your audience is and what you want them to get from it. And then lastly, what are cultural symbols or aesthetics that can enhance the data or enrich the stories being told? I'm a huge fan of weaving in things that maybe other people, the general public, might not see, or just see oh, that's a pretty bird, but someone from the community that I'm making the map for might see it and think wow, that's so cool, they wove that in. They knew that I would see that, and that would mean something to me. So I love doing little things like that. And I think even the smallest intentional decisions around design can make a drastic difference in how we perceive and understand and engage with the data being represented. So it's not just, oh, I want to make a map that looks nice. There's serious repercussions for the design choices we make, good and bad. So it's always best to be intentional about what those design decisions are. And lastly, some reminders. This is my last slide, and then we'll have time for questions. As I showed you, maps don't have to be oriented north-south. I also think that maps don't need to be navigable and don't need to be designed with navigation in mind. So most of the maps on these slides are not meant for navigation and wouldn't be useful in navigating, but that's not their point. Maps also don't need to be, quote, accurate representations of space, meaning they don't need to be Western representations of space. So there's some really cool examples of historic Indigenous maps where the scale that was being used was travel distance rather than kind of a abstract measurement like kilometers or miles. And so when colonial forces engaged with those peoples and saw those maps, their first thought was wow, Indians have no spatial awareness. These maps are really crappy. But it turns out they were exceptionally accurate, much more so than any of the maps Europeans were making of the same spaces at that time. Also, I think maps can and often should have art on them. I had somebody ask me once, do you make art with maps on them, or do you make maps with art on them? Or art with maps or maps with art? And I don't think there should be a semantic difference. I think all maps are art, whether you intend for them to be or not. And the best thing you can do is to be intentional about it. Maps don't need to be in English. They don't need to have any words on them at all. I think one of the most powerful things about maps is that they're legible to people who are illiterate. That's incredible. There's no other way of, graphically writing a story that's similar in that way. Sure, there's other forms of visual arts, but oftentimes those are a lot more interpretive. Maps, I think, are a really beautiful way of communicating that have the potential to be kind of standardized or easy to read, even if you're illiterate. Maps can also include as wide or as narrow of a timeline as you'd like and don't have to use a Western idea of time. So for example, when I make maps documenting violence, I often show historic incidents of violence like massacre sites alongside current instances of violence like murder locations or even things like prison locations, to say that for us as Indigenous people, but I think this extends to other communities as well, when we're navigating the landscape, we have a very different experience of it because the legacies of that historic violence are still playing out. And we still know where those things have happened, and it still means something to us. Like we can literally feel it in our bodies. And so it doesn't make sense to not put it on the map if it's a felt part of the landscape. It doesn't matter how long it happened ago. So these are some of the ways that I encourage people to really enact cartographic freedom. Like I said, I think maps can be anything you want them to be, as long as it's intentional and as long as it's done in a good way, and can be a big part of our work in trying to make our communities more just. I've written about maps as what I think the most literal path to decolonization, because they force us to have conversations around territory and belonging and violence and epistemologies and relationships, all of the things that we have to have hard conversations about to try to move towards decolonization. Maps can propel us and facilitate us in having those conversations. So thanks for tuning in and listening to me nerding out about maps for 45 minutes. And with that, I will open it up to questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anita. That was really marvelous and informative. And I, for one, am inspired to become a cartographer after listening to that. I really love the practical advice you gave and all the ideas, but also the way that you bring the personal experience into the research, into the map making. We do have a number of questions coming in, so I'm just going to go ahead and start reading through those. So the first one is from Joey Orr. You mentioned taking GIS information and then making the map coherent. In your experience with your own mapping practices, what makes a map coherent?
Man, that's a good question. I think the question, I would reframe it to be as coherent for who, and coherent for which story or which goal. But I think what I mean by that is, especially for my work, since I'm mapping very real, intimate experiences of violence, focusing on things like gender violence, that I think programs, any kind of GIS program, I don't want to single one out over the other. The power in those programs is to transform large amounts of data quickly into geographically distributed graphics. And that is useful, but it doesn't, I don't think we can trust a software system of any kind to fully translate human experiences of violence into something that resonates with other humans in a way that empowers or mobilizes us to address the violence. That's not what they're designed to do. And I'm not sure that a machine is fully capable of doing that, no matter how sophisticated it's programmed. And so what I mean by creating a coherent narrative is that there's so much of the narrative that GIS is just not capable of creating, because that's not what it's used for. That's not what it's designed for. And so when you look at some of my previous maps, see if I can go back. For example, this one. Yes, GIS could distribute the points where they're supposed to go. Yes, you could change the colors of the map to be red and add text. Yes, you can even add images. But I don't think, like, the actual process of creating this map, the amount of time it took to really play with the graphics and to be really intentional about them, my experience, and granted, I'm somebody who's like, I've admitted I avoid GIS like the plague. Maybe things have gotten better since the last time I tried to play around with it. It's just really limiting in terms of what you're able to do with it from an aesthetic point of view. And to me, the aesthetics are not decorative. They're part of the narrative. They're part of what makes the narrative coherent and feelable. And so that's why I think that moving things out of GIS, even if that's what you have to use to create the initial map to find out where all the points go, or where all the lines go or whatever, moving things out of GIS gives you the freedom to create a felt narrative in the way that GIS is just not designed to do.
Thank you. Thank you. Next question is from Tamara Falikov. This is an incredible presentation. I agree with that. Thank you for sharing your important social justice work with us. I'm wondering what we might do if there are people who would be vulnerable if they were mapped, such as Indigenous Mexican communities who might be undocumented. It is a question we are grappling with, as we would like to work with these community groups in terms of language and culture in the diaspora in the US, but not necessarily locate them given their precarity.
That's another reason I don't use GIS. I think there's been some initiatives that push for, creating things using like Google Maps, which is great because Google Maps is super accessible, but it also means that none of your data is private or secure. And so there's some projects like that that are just, better in something like Illustrator where it's offline and you have more privacy and more security. But I also think that there's some instances. So for example, this map of my own story, like it could have criminalized all four of us and our stories. Some of the things that I could have shared or mapped out. And so I was really intentional about doing it in a way that protected their identities and mine, while also being true to our stories. And for me, this map in particular, there's no place names. Like you can see there's a screenshot from Google Earth with like some rivers, but unless you really knew all of the geographies of all of the rivers in this, massive region that I was referring to, which was Pacific Northwest, you would have no idea where this actually happened. And so it gave some privacy while still having it connected to the land. But I do want to honor that, like, for example, at SBI, we have a sister collective in Mexico who's mapping femicide of Indigenous women in Mexico. And they also have, security concerns around fearing for their lives in terms of retributive violence for documenting that kind of data. There are some really great initiatives that are working with groups like that to create data sharing and mapping technologies that are really secure. So I do want to uplift Terra Stories as an example of that. Digital Democracy has put out an Earth Defenders Toolkit, which has really phenomenal resources. It was specifically designed for Indigenous communities that are fighting resources extraction and related violence on their homelands. And it was specifically designed to be accessed offline and to have a lot of kind of security protocols around who even is able to access it, how the community is able to share it with maybe neighboring communities or people who need access and are approved versus government agencies or law enforcement or even the extractive industry companies themselves. So there are people grappling with these security issues and actively coming up with solutions.
Thank you. Next question is from James Yeku. Thank you, Anita, for sharing your insights with us. I'm wondering if you could speak more about the concept of mapping, not in the sense of digital visualization, but as a way of knowing worldviews, spaces, and cultures, or a mode of Indigenous cartography that generates its own knowledges independently of the assault of coloniality. Thank you.
That feels like a multi-part question that I might need to read and ruminate on a few times. What immediately comes to mind is Renee Poulani-Lewis's work. She's somebody that I really look to as a fellow Indigenous cartographer, and I call her my academic auntie. She's done her book on Kanaka cartography, so Native Hawaiian cartography is beautiful and amazing, and I think gets at what you're asking, which is an idea of Indigenous cartography and map making that's completely independent of colonialism and whatever colonialism has done to us, and not necessarily looking backwards to try to rebuild something that's been taken or been attacked, but building something that's very much in the current reality and the current epistemology, and the current needs of the community. And she does really fabulous work with utilizing Hawaiian language and stories and ways of knowing, to create a whole language for grappling with what Hawaiian cartography might look like, informed by cultural experiences rather than colonialism. So I would definitely recommend her book and her ongoing work as an example of that.
Thank you. I'm going to go to a question that came in via the chat. And this is from Sylvia Fernandez. You talked about not orienting North-South maps as a way of decolonization in relation to this approach. Do you have thoughts about decolonization approaches to challenge geopolitical borders in territories?
Yeah, I mean, I'm down for anything that criticizes a colonial border or moves beyond it. And I'll say that our work at SBI and trying to map femicide of Indigenous women and missing and murdered Indigenous people as a whole, we've always worked across colonial borders very intentionally, and that's part of our work. So our database started US and Canada in 2018 or in early 2019. We expanded it to be inclusive of Indigenous peoples throughout the Americas. And last month, we actually hired someone who's Indigenous to the Philippines, who's working on doing outreach to expand it to the Pacific as well. And so one of the things that I value most about, what started as a humble little mapping project is that now the excitement around mapping and gathering this data has led to creating new forms of kinship across colonial borders that I think we did have prior to colonization, and that now we have a chance to revitalize and reimagine and put back into practice. So that includes our mapping work and the data collection, but also, as I mentioned, our sister collective in Mexico. We're also part of a intercontinental working group on mapping femicide across the Americas. And it's been really amazing to be part of that. And there's Indigenous women from multiple countries in the group. And so that's been one way of us actively, not only just saying forget the border, that's not something we're willing to honor or acknowledge, but also saying that what if we dismantled the border in our work? What if we actively critiqued it in our work by constantly pointing out that it does not have power over us, it does not define for us who is Indigenous and who's not, and it doesn't define our kinship and our set of relations and who we're accountable to. And so that's a commitment we've made as an organization and that I've made in my work.
Thank you. Ignacio Carvajal asks, thank you so much for your amazing presentation and for sharing your work and yourself with us. Could you speak a bit more about how you see or approach interpretation of maps that you create? Do you think that you seek to put a specific message forward or open up multiple interpretations to the map's audiences?
I think any object is going to have multiple interpretations and multiple different kinds of engagements with it. I actually was on a panel with Renee Poulani-Lewis earlier this week, and one of the things that I love that she said was, I don't care what people think about my maps. And we don't usually hear that in academia. I just don't care what people think of my work. I'm going to do it anyways. And to me, that was kind of validating and freeing of yeah, this map is for me. The map on this slide was not for anyone but me. And I shared it with the world because I published it. But the process of creating it, the end goal of creating it was me and my healing and my ability to tell my story on my own terms. So sometimes what other people get from it just doesn't matter to me that much. But I also think that, especially, I can only speak to my experience and the kind of work that I map. I think that like in the past, I have had people react to some of my maps in ways that I would disagree with or ways that were unsettling for me. But those have been learning moments for me about thinking through all of the assumptions that we make about maps, and different kind of epistemologies around what a map is and what it's supposed to do. So for example, I presented some of these same maps on these slides at the International Cartographic Conference a few years ago, and there was, about half the room was super supportive, and the other half of the room was like a bunch of angry white male nerds that were like, these aren't maps. And were like really angry and defensive and emotional about it in a way that I did not understand and was really unsettling. And then since then, I've had a lot of people reach out to me about these maps and this kind of work and mapping femicide of Indigenous women in particular, and like treating it almost as a form of armchair exploration, and as a way of like surveillance of a colonial problem, of, thinking like, well, so you can give me all this data and I'm going to put it into GIS, and we're just going to solve the problem that way. We're going to figure out this crisis of why all these women are disappearing. And, it's going to be done by 5 o'clock, and then I'm going to go have a sandwich for dinner. Like, that's the kind of dialogues that people end up having with me about mapping this kind of data and these kinds of stories. And for me, that doesn't tell me anything about my map or my work, but that tells me a lot about their perception of what a map is, their insecurities around the kind of authority and the kind of stories that maps are supposed to have and tell, and who's allowed to be a map maker. And to me, that's almost more interesting than the narrative that I'm trying to say in the map to begin with.
So interesting. We're just about out of time. Maybe we have time for one more quick question. There's a question here from Titi Ayegbusi. Were there things you weren't considering when you set out on your mapping project that you discovered along the way? And if so, how did these help shape your research?
I think a big thing for me, when I first started making maps on missing and murdered Indigenous women, like this one, because I wasn't necessarily a part of that movement yet, and I wasn't, this wasn't in the capacity of working for an organization or, being funded or supported to do this work in any kind of way. It was just something like I literally did it at Panera because I couldn't afford Wi-Fi at home, and my hand was still broken from the abuse. It was very humble beginnings. So because of that, when I started, I wasn't working with the families. And that's something that, looking back, I deeply regret, because now that I've worked with families for several years, I've learned the stories are 10 times, sometimes 100 times richer than what you can find using public sources, when you're actually able to build a relationship and build trust with the family. And there's things about the way the system grapples with indigeneity and gender and death, things that I would never anticipate or expect, that I've learned through direct casework with families. And so I realize that's a really specific example, but I think that teaching from that overall is that when we're mapping these human experiences of violence, it's really important to do community grounded work that puts survivors and their families at the forefront, because not only because it's ethically the right thing to do, but also because the data and the stories are that much stronger because of it.